Every religion claims to have answers about what happens after death: heaven for the good, hell for the bad, reincarnation, nirvana, or something else entirely. But here's the first shower thought: they can't all be right. If Christians are correct, Muslims and Hindus are wrong. If Hindus are correct, then Christians and Muslims are wrong. If Buddhists are correct, almost everyone else is wrong. Billions of people are sure they've got the truth, but their truths contradict. And when you put them side by side, another possibility becomes more likely. Maybe none of them have the answer. Maybe heaven and hell aren't destinations at all, but cultural stories we tell to ease the fear of death. The idea of heaven sounds comforting at first: eternal peace, joy, reunion with loved ones. But think about it carefully. Eternal means forever. If living on earth for 70 years can feel repetitive, how would eternity not become unbearable? A heaven that never ends would eventually become boring to the point of torment. And if boredom is a kind of suffering, then heaven starts to look like a disguised hell. And what about identity? If your personality and memories remain intact, eternity means carrying every flaw forever. But if you lose those flaws, are you even the same person anymore? The comforting picture of heaven falls apart when you press on the details. Hell is even more troubling. Eternal punishment for finite mistakes. A person could live a decent life, but if they pick the wrong religion or make the wrong choices, they face endless torment. That's not justice, that's cruelty. And if God is supposed to be infinitely loving, how does infinite torture fit the picture? Even when believers soften the idea, describing hell as separation from God rather than fire and brimstone, it still fails, because separation forever is still a punishment, and one you can't appeal or escape. Consent and fairness disappear. The very idea of hell reveals a system that values obedience over justice. Now think about hypocrisy. Many believers talk about compassion, forgiveness, and love, but they also endorse a system where most of humanity is condemned to hell. They say God loves everyone, but love that ends in eternal torture isn't love at all. It's manipulation. And it's not just theology, it's practice. Leaders preach humility while living in luxury. Churches demand forgiveness from victims while protecting abusers. Politicians quote scripture while exploiting fear for power. The gap between belief and behavior exposes the hollowness of the system. Here's the deeper thought: if heaven is incoherent, hell is unjust, and hypocrisy runs deep. Maybe these ideas survive not because they're true, but because they're useful. Heaven motivates obedience with promises. Hell enforces obedience with fear. Hypocrisy protects institutions by excusing double standards. None of that describes reality, it describes control. And once you see that, the stories lose their power. Heaven becomes less of a destination and more of a distraction. Hell becomes less of a threat and more of a tool. Hypocrisy becomes less surprising and more predictable. One strange thing about heaven is how differently people imagine it. Ask 10 believers what heaven looks like, and you'll get 10 answers. Streets of gold, clouds and harps, endless worship services, reunions with loved ones, eternal youth, even things like golf courses or mansions depending on who you ask. The Bible itself gives conflicting descriptions, sometimes a city, sometimes a banquet, sometimes endless singing. The Quran describes gardens with rivers of milk and honey, and companions created for pleasure. Hindu traditions describe heavenly realms that are temporary, not eternal. If heaven were real, shouldn't the details be consistent? The contradictions across religions and even within them suggest people are projecting their own desires. Heaven looks like whatever you most want: comfort, reward, escape. That's not evidence of truth. That's evidence of wishful thinking. Then there's the problem of who gets in. Most religions put strict conditions on heaven. In Christianity, it depends on faith in Jesus. In Islam, on submission to Allah. In Hinduism, on karma and rebirth. In Buddhism, heaven isn't even the goal, but a detour on the way to enlightenment. Billions of people automatically fail to qualify just by being born in the wrong culture. That raises a question believers rarely want to face. If heaven is the reward for choosing correctly, why would a loving God make the odds so impossible? A child born in India, raised Hindu, may never have a chance to seriously consider Christianity. A child raised in a strict Muslim household may never truly evaluate Buddhism. Yet under most religious systems, those children are condemned from the start. The inconsistency here is staggering. Heaven is marketed as ultimate justice, but it's built on the lottery of birth. That's not justice, that's randomness dressed up as morality. Hell exposes the same contradictions. Many believers insist hell is necessary to uphold justice, but then describe heaven as a place where even mass murderers can enter if they repent. That means a serial killer who accepts God gets paradise, while a kind atheist who saves lives but doesn't believe burns forever. If morality worked like that in any other system, we'd reject it immediately. Some try to soften hell into a choice. People choose separation from God. But separation isn't chosen if the alternative is eternal torment. That's like saying a prisoner chooses their cell because they refuse to obey the warden. It's not choice when refusal means punishment without end. The hypocrisy extends beyond theology into how heaven and hell are used in everyday life. Preachers talk about free will, but threaten hell for exercising it. They talk about unconditional love, but attach conditions. They say God is merciful, but describe punishments harsher than anything a human tyrant could imagine. And in practice, hell is often weaponized. Children are told they'll burn forever if they doubt. Adults are pressured into obedience by fear. Politicians leverage belief in hell to gain votes, framing opponents as ungodly threats. The concept, no matter how it's packaged, functions less as truth and more as social control. This brings us back to the shower thought. If heaven and hell contradict each other across religions, and hypocrisy follows wherever the ideas are preached, what's left? The most reasonable conclusion is that these concepts aren't descriptions of reality at all. They're human inventions, tailored to keep people in line. But there's another layer. If you strip away the promises of heaven and the threats of hell, you start to see how morality functions without them. People don't need eternal reward or punishment to value kindness, fairness, and empathy. These values work here and now, without appeals to the afterlife. In fact, removing the afterlife might make morality more urgent, because this life becomes the only one that counts. Think about the psychology of heaven and hell. Both concepts exploit two of the strongest human motivators, desire and fear. Heaven appeals to desire, endless joy, reunion, satisfaction of every need. Hell appeals to fear, eternal pain, loss, isolation. Together they create a powerful system of control, offer a reward too good to refuse, threaten a punishment too terrible to risk, and people will obey almost anything. It's the same mechanism used in politics, advertising, and even parenting at times, the carrot and the stick. But in religion, the stakes are pushed to infinity. Heaven isn't just a prize, it's eternal perfection. Hell isn't just a punishment, it's infinite torment. The scale makes the system nearly impossible to challenge for those who believe, but that scale also reveals the weakness. Because once you realize no system of justice in real life would ever use infinite punishment for finite mistakes, hell becomes implausible. And once you realize no experience could remain joyful forever without eventually becoming unbearable, heaven becomes incoherent. Another shower thought: if heaven is perfect, then free will disappears. Because free will includes the possibility of making mistakes, of causing harm. But if nobody in heaven can make mistakes, then free will doesn't exist. And if free will doesn't exist, the people in heaven aren't the same people they were on earth. They're changed, stripped of flaws, sanitized. So what enters heaven? If it's not the flawed human being with real choices, it's a copy, a version of you altered to fit perfection. Which raises the question, is that really you? Or is heaven just populated by shells of people who once lived, but no longer carry the complexity that made them human? And if heaven requires removing your flaws, desires, and individuality, what's left is a kind of cosmic conformity, a place where everyone thinks the same, feels the same, acts the same. That doesn't sound like paradise. It sounds like loss of identity. Hell creates its own contradictions too. If hell exists, then God created it, which means God designed a system where the majority of humans, by many religious standards, are destined for eternal suffering. That would make God less loving than the average human parent. No parent would torture their child forever for disobedience. Yet religion asks people to worship a deity who supposedly does exactly that. And even if you try to frame hell as justice, it still fails, because justice requires proportionality. A punishment should fit the crime. No crime committed in a finite lifetime could possibly justify eternal torment. The idea collapses the moment you apply basic fairness. Now let's talk hypocrisy again. Many religious leaders describe heaven and hell with absolute certainty, but live as though neither exists. If a preacher really believed billions were going to hell, how could they justify spending money on mansions, cars, or political campaigns instead of saving souls? If they really believed heaven awaited them, why do they cling to earthly power and wealth? The disconnection between belief and action is telling. Heaven and hell are preached with passion, but lived with indifference. The gap suggests that even those who preach the loudest don't truly believe as literally as they claim. The concepts function more as tools of persuasion than convictions deeply felt. Here's the final thought for this part. Heaven, hell, and hypocrisy form a cycle. Heaven motivates through desire, hell coerces through fear, and hypocrisy keeps the system running by excusing contradictions. None of it holds up under scrutiny, but together they create a structure that sustains belief generation after generation. Once you see that cycle clearly, you realize it doesn't describe reality. It describes psychology, sociology, and power. Heaven is a projection of longing. Hell is a projection of fear. Hypocrisy is the glue that allows leaders to preach what they don't practice. The cycle isn't divine, it's human, and the moment you step outside of it, the world becomes clearer. You don't need heaven to find joy. You don't need hell to avoid harm. And you don't need hypocrisy to justify contradictions. You only need honesty, compassion, and a willingness to face reality as it is. Another layer to consider is how heaven and hell reflect cultural values more than divine truth. In ancient times, heaven wasn't described as mansions or golden streets. It was more like a kingdom or a banquet, ideas that fit the world people knew. Later, Western Christianity described heaven as clouds and harps, because those symbols matched medieval art and imagination. In Islamic tradition, heaven includes gardens and rivers, perfect for people living in arid deserts. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, heavenly realms look like palaces of wealth and abundance, reflecting social ideals of prosperity. When you see this, heaven looks less like an eternal destination and more like a mirror of earthly desires. Each culture imagines paradise in its own terms, which makes sense if these are stories invented by humans, but not if they're revelations from a universal truth. Hell also shifts with culture. Early Jewish texts barely mention it, focusing more on Sheol, a shadowy place of the dead. Later, Christianity sharpened the idea into eternal fire. Medieval art exaggerated it into horrific imagery: demons, torture, endless flames. Islam describes hell in graphic physical terms, while Buddhism and Hinduism speak of many hells, each reflecting specific punishments. The common theme is fear, but the details change, and those details always fit the concerns of the time. In medieval Europe, hell was full of fire and torture because fire and torture were the punishments people knew. In other cultures, hell included icy wastes, endless hunger, or humiliation, again reflecting what people feared most. Hell adapts, which makes sense if it's a human construction, but not if it's an eternal reality. Now think about the moral contradictions these ideas create. If heaven is a reward for faith, not deeds, then morality becomes irrelevant. A murderer who repents at the last moment earns paradise, while a kind skeptic earns hell. If hell is punishment for disbelief rather than harm caused, then morality again becomes irrelevant. People are judged not on how they lived, but on whether they believed the right story. This isn't morality, it's tribalism. It divides the world into insiders and outsiders, believers and non-believers, with reward or punishment tied to loyalty instead of justice. And when people internalize this logic, it justifies cruelty in the name of faith, wars, persecutions, inquisitions, all justified because outsiders deserve hell anyway. The hypocrisy deepens when you notice how believers talk about heaven and hell in casual ways, joking about someone going to hell over a mistake, claiming a dead celebrity is in a better place without evidence, using heaven and hell as shorthand for approval or disapproval. It's striking how lightly such enormous claims are thrown around. If people truly believed in eternal torment or eternal bliss, their behavior would look radically different, but instead the concepts are treated like background noise, a script repeated out of habit. That gap between the supposed seriousness of the belief and the casual way it's used is itself a form of hypocrisy. Here's the closing thought for this section. Heaven and hell aren't timeless truths, they're cultural stories, reshaped to fit human hopes and fears. And hypocrisy is what allows those stories to continue even when the details don't make sense. The cycle repeats across centuries. Each generation reinterprets heaven to match its desires, reinvents hell to match its fears, and excuses the contradictions through selective teaching and practice. And all of it survives not because it's true, but because it's useful. Once you see the cultural fingerprints, the contradictions, and the hypocrisy, the spell starts to break. Heaven loses its glow, hell loses its terror, and hypocrisy loses its excuse. What remains is the chance to build morality and meaning without relying on borrowed threats and promises. There's a bigger question that heaven, hell, and hypocrisy raise. What does it say about a God who needs these ideas at all? If a God is all-loving, why use threats of eternal punishment or promises of eternal reward to secure devotion? Genuine love doesn't demand loyalty through fear or bribery. If heaven and hell are necessary to make people obey, then morality in religion isn't really morality. It's compliance under duress. Think about it. If you avoid harm only because of hell, or do good only because of heaven, are you moral? Or are you just following orders? Real morality means doing what's right because it matters here and now, not because of what might happen after death. Heaven and hell also reveal the problem of exclusivity. Each religion claims its version is the only true one. Christians believe heaven is for them. Muslims believe paradise is for them. Hindus describe heavenly realms accessible through karma and devotion. Buddhists treat heavenly realms as distractions. These can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. And if they are all wrong, what's left? A reality where death is final, but life matters even more because of it. A world where morality isn't tied to eternal judgment, but to the consequences of our actions here and now. A perspective where we don't divide humanity into saved and damned, but see everyone as sharing the same finite existence. The hypocrisy becomes sharpest when you see how leaders use heaven and hell. Preachers promise heaven if you give money. Politicians threaten hell if you vote the wrong way. Cults control members by dangling paradise or punishment. These tactics don't describe reality. They describe manipulation. And yet they work because people fear death and crave meaning. But once you notice the pattern, the manipulation loses its force. The fear of hell starts to look like a tool of control, not a description of reality. The promises of heaven start to look like sales pitches, not eternal truths. The hypocrisy of leaders becomes obvious because their actions rarely match the urgency of their words. Now here's the final shower thought. If heaven existed, would it even be desirable? If hell existed, would it even be just? If hypocrisy is necessary to keep the system alive, what does that say about the system itself? Maybe the reason these ideas collapse under scrutiny is because they were never about truth. They were about control, comfort, and survival in a world where people didn't have better explanations. Heaven gave hope, hell enforced obedience, hypocrisy maintained authority. But none of that requires reality. It only requires belief. So here's where the journey ends. Heaven, hell, and holy hypocrisy aren't eternal truths. They're human inventions. They reflect our desires, our fears, and our contradictions. And once you recognize that, you can step beyond them. You don't need heaven to find joy. You can create joy here. You don't need hell to avoid harm. Empathy and fairness already guide us. You don't need hypocrisy to excuse contradictions. You can live with honesty instead. The most liberating thought isn't that heaven awaits or that hell threatens. It's that this life is the one you have, and that's enough.